This video contains sensitive subjects, such as death. Viewer discretion is advised.
Greetings and good evening. My name is Britt, and this is Macabre History. Here we aren't afraid to explore the dark and sometimes strange parts of history that others would like to avoid. With the current epidemic going on, I thought it would be good to revisit the past. The Black Death, or the Plague, if you will, brought humanity to its knees. It was the greatest equalizer of them all. It didn't care if you were rich, poor, a king, a duke, a merchant, or a serf. There was no modern medicine and no way to know when this was coming and when it was going and how many people it was going to take with it. Because of this, the numbers were greater and the fear was even bigger. So let's explore the Black Death so that we can study history and not repeat it. The term the Black Death is one attributed by historians looking back at the period. The Black Death doesn't really reference anything about the disease at all. It was simply given that name to reference a dark time. During that time, it was often referred to as the Great Pestilence or the Great Mortality, and it was also famously referred to as the Plague. Things to know about medieval society was how it was divided up. There were 3 estates. The first estate being clergy. You could only be from nobility to become clergy. The second estate was the noble class. The noble class were often landowners. They would offer protection, fight wars, fight off invasions, in trade for work on their land. And those who would work their land was the third estate, the commoners, or peasants. Peasants were also known to provide trades, such as a baker or a butcher, a candlestick maker. You get the idea. But at this time, a new estate was emerging, the merchant class. The merchant class were those who would travel to other places and provide goods and trades. This made them extremely wealthy, oftentimes more wealthy than the noble class. The merchant class would not be accepted into the noble class. They were an estate all of their own, who didn't quite fit in this feudal system world.
Self-made, baby.
It may sound bleak to us, but this did offer some sort of structure. Structure that was well needed after the fall of Rome and other kingdoms. And with that information, it's now time to explore the Black Death. Chapter 1: Pathological. The plague is caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. There are 3 forms of plague. The first, bubonic. Bubonic is when the plague infects the lymphatic system in the body. You've seen the famous images of those with buboes, or sacs of infected fluid. There is a 50% chance of surviving bubonic plague. That is without medical attention. The second form of plague is pneumonic. Pneumonic is where the plague infects the lungs. Pneumonic plague was 100% fatal. And the third is the most deadly, septicemic. This is where the plague enters the bloodstream. People who were infected with this form of plague would be alive at breakfast but dead by dinner. Yersinia pestis is a bacteria that had been around for centuries. It usually infected animals. The mutation of Yersinia pestis that infected millions of people in the 1300s was different. This one had mutated to spread easily to humans. It also could easily infect fleas. When Yersinia pestis infects a flea, it forms a thick film of biomaterial on a muscular valve in the stomach of the flea. The weight of this biofilm does not allow the flea to digest any food. Hungry and starving, it continues to feed, but it cannot digest any of the meal. Eventually, it begins to vomit up the infected biofilm. It transmits the bacteria into its host. As the rodents infected with the plague die off, the fleas are left with no host to feed on.
And so they begin to feed on other animals and eventually humans. And this is how it's thought the plague spread. Could flea bites alone have spread this disease as fast as it did? And could one bacteria be the cause of a 50% death toll in Europe during this period?
When archaeologists uncovered mass plague graves, they would study the remains of the victims. Scientists found that there were 2 different strains of plague at the time of the Black Death. The other interesting thing about this is that they found it spread so easily that it actually burned itself out. It had no more victims to claim. Plague is strange because it would disappear and then reappear. From the time that it showed up in the 1300s, we know that it had shown up before, centuries before, the plague of Justinian.
In 541 AD, the plague of Justinian that afflicted the Byzantine Empire, especially its capital, Constantinople. Accounts of the time describe buboes on the body, as well as a fever and vomiting, cough, symptoms very similar to the Black Death. In 2013, studies did confirm that this plague was caused by Yersinia pestis. Scientists disagree on what exactly could have killed so many people. Was it all just Yersinia pestis, or was there something else at work?
Some scholars believe that the Black Death was not caused by plague alone. Up to 50% of the European population died, and up to 50% of the Chinese population also died. And that's not even including the numbers from the Middle East or Russia. Something very odd that scientists noted in the 1980s during the AIDS epidemic was that certain people with European descent had a mutation, a genetic mutation, that made them immune to the HIV virus. Now we know that HIV and the plague are not related. And we know that HIV is caused by a virus, whereas plague is caused by a bacteria. But here's where it gets strange. When they traced back this genetic mutation, it came from the same era as the Black Death. That must mean there was another disease going around at the exact same time. Could these 2 diseases have been working in tandem to wipe out half of the European population? And because of that, did some people form a mutation to protect themselves from this other disease? That is still being debated to this day.
Chapter 2, The Spread.
So now let's get into the history of when the Black Death started and how it spread so quickly. All evidence points to the Black Death starting in China in the 1330s.
Northeastern China is usually arid and dry, but in the 1300s, there is evidence that China experienced an unusually wet season, even in this arid climate. The wet season encouraged more food and vegetation, and thus more rodents repopulated. And as the rodent population grew, the flea population grew. The flea population then had more hosts to spread the bacteria to. However, since this bacteria likes to burn itself out, they ran out of victims, and so the fleas began feeding on humans.
Then there, the bacteria mutated and began jumping from human to human. Records show that there were close to 125 million people in China in the 1330s. Fast forward to 1393, records only show 65 million. There are records of the plague in the Hebei province, killing up to 90% of that population. The plague then continued to spread on to Western Asia, to the Middle East, and then of course finally to Europe, and then Russia. Trade routes were thought to have been how the disease entered Europe. The first European nation to be hit by the plague was Italy. Italy back in the Middle Ages was actually a collection of city-states. In the city-state of Genova, the Mongols and the Genoese had trade agreements.
In 1345, a conflict arose with Genoese traders and the Mongol army sect called the Golden Horde. The conflict became so bad that the Mongol Golden Horde army laid siege to the port city of Kaffa, where both parties did their trade. However, due to the spread of the plague in Asia, the Golden Horde was slowed down, and by the time they reached the city, Many of their army had fallen ill with the disease. As one last hurrah in their battle to overtake the city, the Mongol army catapulted the corpses of soldiers who were overtaken by the plague into the city of Kappa.
Accounts from Genoese at the time state that there were hundreds of bodies, rotting corpses infested with the plague.
From there, the disease began to spread, and Genoese traders fled back home to Italy, only to spread the disease to their homeland. In 1347, ships arrived in Sicily from Kappa, with people suffering from the outbreak. On board the ships were flea-infested rats that poured into the port city upon docking. There was no turning back. During this same period, trade routes on the Silk Road were open and flourishing. Unsuspecting traders bringing goods back to Europe came home sick with a mysterious illness. By the end of 1348, the disease had spread throughout Italy. Letters from the city of Sicily to loved ones detail the damage the outbreak had on society, and those far away knew it was only a matter of time before it arrived on their shores. In Marseille, France, they had attempted to control trade ships to thwart the spread of the plague into their city. Unfortunately, this was in vain. In January of 1348, a ship from Italy arrived carrying the plague and plague-infested rodents. It was now too late. Marseille was overtaken. From there, the disease spread to the rest of France, Spain, Portugal, England, Germany, Scotland, Scandinavia, Norway, and even Iceland. In the span of 8 years, almost all of Europe had been touched by the pestilence. Chapter 3. The Sickness.
In the city of Florence alone, 400 people a day were dying, totaling to 60,000 people. In the city of Avignon, there are accounts of 7,000 homes lying vacant. Its occupants had been devoured by the plague.
As the plague spread, it hit hard. Accounts of the time are terrifying. Jean de Venette, a well-regarded friar from France, recorded his eyewitness account of the events as they unfolded in his hometown.
He who was well one day was dead the next, and being carried to his grave. Swellings appeared suddenly in the armpit or in the groin, in many cases both, and they were infallible signs of death. The sickness or pestilence was called an epidemic by the doctors, wherefore in many towns timid priests withdrew, leaving the exercise of their ministry to such of the religious as were more daring. In many places not 2 out of 20 remained alive. So high was the mortality that for a long time more than 500 dead were carried daily with great devotion in carts for burial. A very great number of the saintly sisters who, not fearing to die, nursed the sick in all sweetness and humanity, with no thought of honor, a number too often renewed by death. Rest in peace with Christ.
The disparity between classes was more evident than ever, as nobles, merchants, lawyers, doctors, church officials, and anyone who had the means or a home outside the city was able to flee, while those who did not have summer homes or their own homes in general were stuck inside the city.
The plague brought with it such a panic. As the death toll rose, cemeteries were filling up so fast that priests couldn't even keep up with all the last rites that they had to read, so they quit doing them. Large mass graves were then dug up and the bodies poured in. No more funerals, no more last rites. Grave diggers and people who pushed dead carts were paid very high wages to keep up with the death toll. In the mornings, the carts would come by, asking people to bring out their dead.
But soon enough, even these people were hard to come by, as the plague took them down as well. An Italian chronicler, Agnolo di Tirra, explained,
"And none could be found to bury the dead, or for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best as they could. Without priests, without divine offices, great pits were dug and piled deep with a multitude of the dead. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo de Torah, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them away. They devoured many bodies through the city. But there was no one who went for death. For all awaited death. And so many had died that all believed it was the end of the world.
People were refusing to help neighbors. People would abandon their children. People were dying in the streets, and chaos ensued.
One account of Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio states,
Such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity. The brother abandoned brother, and the uncle his nephew, and the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that the fathers and mothers refused to see and tend to their children as if they had not been theirs. The plight of the lower and middle classes was even more pitiful to behold. Most of them remained in their houses either through poverty or in hopes of safety, and fell sick by the thousands. Since they received no care and attention, almost all of them died. Many ended their lives in the streets both at night and during the day, and many others who died in their houses were only known to be dead because the neighbors smelled their decaying bodies.
and as the chaos ensued, people wondered why this was happening. What was the cause of this disease? Was it God's punishment? In medieval times, religion was everything. It was common for people to attend church multiple times a day.
With this epidemic, people turned to the church for advice. The church was such a big part of their lives, but the church was a mess itself. The Pope himself had gone into isolation at the recommendation of one of his physicians. The Pope had 2 burning barrels beside him at all times. This was thought to ward the plague off. The imagery of the Pope himself in a dark, cramped room surrounded by burning flames is quite ironic.
Since so many church officials had either abandoned their posts or became victims themselves of the plague, many church positions lied vacant and open. In the feudal system of medieval times, you had to be from nobility in order to become a church official. However, with so many vacant positions open, for the first time, anybody could apply for those positions.
People were also able to move up in the rankings much more quickly because there was nobody above them. And with these rankings came higher wages.
But as progressive and exciting as this was, some people had a problem with it.
And many people were frustrated with the church, believing that the new officials were only interested in money. Sometimes that was true, but sometimes it wasn't. Many of these officials did give their lives in the end to comfort the sick.
People's frustrations and distrust of the church became more evident in the plague outbreak. Even as some of their own comrades joined the church, they accused them of only being interested in the wages and the ability to move up the ranks so quickly. Due to this distrust, you see a rise in the mendicant order,
or friars. These people did not own land, unlike priests and the Pope himself. They were not wealthy. They did not have a home. Instead, they traveled to all the cities and spent most of their time with the poor. The people loved them.
People trusted friars way more than they trusted their church.
The church, however, saw this as a big threat. They were already losing order. They could not afford to lose people's loyalty.
Chapter 4: Hue and Cry. With the frayed relationship between people in the church, many people became vocal about what was causing the plague. Clearly, some argued, God is punishing us for our sins, and they believed that they had a solution to seek redemption. And so some people turned to the flagellance movement. Flagellance is something that is still around to this day. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, flagellants are a medieval religious sect that included public beatings with whips as part of their discipline and devotional practice. Flagellant sects arose in northern Italy and had become large and widespread by about 1260. Groups marched through European towns, whipping each other to atone for their sins. and calling on to the populace to repent. End quote. During the Black Death, the flagellance movement gained a lot of followers and respect.
Groups of men decked out in robes that resembled those worn in biblical times, holding giant wooden crosses and whips that they would whip themselves with, wandered from city to city. They were trying to suffer as Jesus had suffered. They believed that by whipping themselves, they were atoning for their sins and the sins of others. Some of their behavior was pretty extreme. They would barge into churches half-dressed, lay out on the grounds, while one of them would go around and whip all of the flagellance members. Some people loved this, and they acquired fans or groupies. Other people were disgusted by this, but the movement kind of slowed down when they started dragging the corpses of dead children and whipped themselves, hoping to bring the child back to life. At that point, people had had enough of them. The other thought belief that arose at this time was hedonism.
Hedonism was the belief that since God had turned his back on the people and left them to die, they might as well enjoy their last days on Earth. Activities included the classic sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
They were going to die anyway, so they might as well die having fun. Something that most people would have never done in their lives was a reality now.
But while some people focused in on God's wrath, others turned their attention to the stars.
Those who did not believe that the plague was God's punishment believed that it was due to the alignment of the planets. They thought certain planets dropped evil vapors into the atmosphere.
An article by Stanford University Press explains that this belief goes back to the times of Aristotle. Quote, "It is believed that the conjunction of Mars and Jupiter causes a great pestilence in the air, especially when they come together in a hot, wet sign, as was the case in 1345. For Jupiter, being wet and hot, draws up evil vapors from the Earth and Mars because it is immoderately hot and dry, and then ignites the vapors, and as a result, there were lightning, sparks, noxious vapors, and fires throughout the air."
So wet and hot.
Blaming planetary alignment or an omnipotent God is one thing, but some people wanted a more tangible scapegoat for this plague. One account from a Franciscan friar, Hermann Gigas, reveals, quote,
Some say that it was brought about by the corruption of the air, others that the Jews planned to wipe out all of the Christians with poison, and had poisoned the wells and springs everywhere. And many Jews confessed as much under torture, that they had bred spiders and toads in pots and pans and had obtained poison from overseas, and that not every Jew knew of this wickedness, only the more powerful ones, so that it would not be betrayed. As evidence of this heinous crime, men say that bags full of poison were found in many wells and springs. God, the Lord of vengeance, has not suffered the malice of the Jews to go unpunished. Throughout Germany, in all but a few places, they were burned. For fear of that punishment, many accepted baptism and their lives were spared. This action was taken against the Jews in 1349, and it still continues unabated, for in a number of regions many people, noble and humble alike, have laid plans against them and their defenders, which they will never abandon until the whole Jewish race has been destroyed. Hermann Gigas.
Communities throughout Europe were executing Jewish people, and one village executed all of its Jewish members in one evening. This didn't make any sense, because Jewish people were dying at the same rate.
In the darkest of times, many people's true colors were showing, and the poor Jewish people, already facing a plague themselves, were now facing persecution on top of that. This ignorance and racism led to what is now referred to as the Strasbourg Massacre. On February 14, 1349, in Strasbourg, France, several hundred Jews were burned to death at the stake. Those who were not burned at the stake were then banished from the city altogether. Chapter 5: Flowers and Herbs. Medieval medicine was not advanced enough to fight back at Yersinia pestis. In fact, many of the remedies used probably just made the suffering even worse.
At this time, people still believed in miasma, or bad smells that cause these diseases, as well as the balancing of humors in the body.
In the 14th century, the body was believed to have been made up of 4 different humors, or biles. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, humor, in early Western physiological theory, is one of the 4 fluids of the body that were thought to determine a person's temperament and features. Quote, in the European Middle Ages and later, the 4 cardinal humors were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The variant mixtures of these humors in different persons determined their complexions or temperaments, their physical and mental qualities, and their dispositions. The ideal person had the ideally proportioned mixture of the 4, and the only way to fix this imbalance was through bloodletting. Doctors would cut a person and drain the blood themselves, or supply leeches that would leach out the blood from their hosts. Either way, you can imagine this was very uncomfortable, especially for someone who is already suffering. And that was the problem with many of these, quote, cures, is that it caused more suffering in the end. For example, another remedy was rubbing herbs and feces onto the buboes. This most likely made the infection even worse. Another remedy, placing giant barrels of fire and using aromatherapy. I'm sure a smoky room was not that comfortable to lie in for a long time.
Doctors developed the first hazmat suit, or the plague doctor.
Although there were quote-unquote plague doctors at this time, the famous costume of the creepy bird-like figure would not become prevalent until the 17th century.
The plague doctor suit almost looks like a giant bird, and in the beak of this they would place fragrant flowers and herbs because they thought they were combating the bad smells that caused the plague. Not all advice was unsound though. Many people opted to stay inside, avoid close contact with others, and drink lots of fluids. That's something we would recommend today.
But although the remedies at the time were anything but helpful, the plague did open the doors for science and medicine. In 1300, the Pope had outlawed any surgeries or dissections of bodies, even if they were already dead. It was looked at as body mutilation. After the plague pandemic, the Pope himself allowed his personal physician to dissect a victim of the plague. By allowing dissections, medical science was able to advance more. This gave scientists insight on the human body and was the building blocks for what is now modern medicine. Chapter 6: The Reckoning. Society changed in radical ways that would have never been possible if it hadn't been for the plague. Some historians believe that some of the progress made would have taken centuries originally, but with people so desperate, they had to make some changes to the way things were done.
Once the plague was gone, it left a very different Europe.
For one, the class structure saw quite a shift. Due to the immense mortality rate, it is estimated that up to 375 million people were taken by the plague. This drastically changed the class structure.
Peasants were in such high demand to work the fields that they saw their wages raise almost 3 times as much as before. They were also now being paid in cash, whereas before they were paid for trade. The rent for their homes was lower because there was nobody left to rent to.
Some peasants were able to save up enough to purchase land of their own and pass that down from generation to generation.
Peasants now could purchase their own land, not only because they had the money, but because the land was available.
Due to these higher wages, many nobles were light on gold, and so they married into the merchant class, who had plenty of gold. The nobility would bring their titles, and the merchants would bring their money. Gone was the feudal system of the past. In years to come, this would lead to the serfs' revolt.
In urban areas, certain goods and services were few and far between. Although there was plenty of livestock, other trades such as blacksmiths or candle makers left those goods in scarcity because those tradesmen died of the plague and took with them all their knowledge on that trade. Because of this, people actually moved closer together so that there were more blacksmiths or candle makers or farmers in an area. Another thing you saw was women joining the workforce. So many of them had lost their husbands during this time, and they needed to feed their children, so they stepped up and took on the trade themselves. This also led to a lower birth rate because mothers were now working. It is thought by historians that it took over 300 years for the population to reach pre-plague levels again. Plague would continue to show up every decade or so. It was never as expedient or as devastating as it had been in the 1300s. And with that, people came up with solutions to combat the plague. Not all of these were great solutions. However, there were some good ones. One not so great solution was to create a pest house. This was a house that people could send the sick to. In theory, it sounds great to isolate the sick from the well. However, these homes were notoriously filthy, and because the plague had such a low survival rate, it was more of a death house than anything. People were horrified to have their loved one taken away to die alone in one of these homes. Another thing they started doing, which is something we're seeing now, is pubs were closed down. Cities would be put under quarantine. After 1666, the plague had all but disappeared. It wouldn't reoccur again until the 19th century in China. Plague is still around to this day. It can still be found in China, as well as the Western United States. The cases of plague have slowed way down. There's usually only a max up to 20 people in the whole world per year who contract it. Antibiotics have come a long way in helping us with that.
Nowadays, we are so lucky to have technology and medicine. Without this, the current pandemic we're seeing today could have been much worse.
Remember, when you're feeling stressed out, that we now have medical science on our side, that we now understand where diseases originate from, and we don't have half-naked men wandering around whipping themselves. At least not in public. Sleep tight.
I warned you, and I am willing to change. I don't need a stage. I'm so unlike you. Snake oil all on my skin. Snake oil salesman.